The galaxy called her a traitor. The Aurelian Empire said Princess Lyra Valen abandoned her duty for one human billionaire from Earth. But no one knew the truth behind that choice. The human she protected did not seek power, a throne, or influence. He uncovered a hidden failure inside one of the oldest civilizations among the stars, forcing an empire to face the question it feared most. Could it change before it forgot the people it was built to protect? Welcome to Galactic Contact. We wish you a wonderful viewing experience and a day filled with happiness. Now, let's begin this extraordinary story. The galaxy did not remember the day Princess Lyra Valen lost her crown. It remembered the day she was accused of betraying everything she had spent her life protecting. The announcement reached every major world in the Aurelian Empire within hours. A royal daughter had abandoned imperial authority. A human outsider had influenced the decisions of a civilization older than most known governments. The name attached to the accusation was Alexander Reed. But the truth behind that name was far more complicated. The Hall of Sovereignty was silent when Lyra entered. The chamber had witnessed centuries of decisions, alliances, and conflicts. Its walls carried the history of a species that had survived because it valued order above all else. Today, that same order was questioning one of its own. Lyra stood beneath the ancient symbols of the Aurelian dynasty without her ceremonial guard. Her blue skin reflected the cold, artificial light above. The silver patterns along her face remained motionless, hiding the emotions expected of someone born into power. Across the chamber, Chancellor Valar Thane watched her carefully. He was not an enemy. He was a leader who had spent more than 2 centuries preventing disasters across the empire. "Princess Lyra," he said quietly, "do you understand what your actions have created?" She looked at the council members surrounding him. Scientists, administrators, military advisors, people who had protected billions through decisions that were rarely simple. "Yes," she answered. "I understand." Valar placed a data file onto the central display. The information spread across the chamber. Colony resource models, infrastructure reports, internal investigations. "You exposed classified concerns without completing the full evaluation process," he said. "You created uncertainty in a civilization that depends on stability." Lyra did not deny it. That was what surprised them. She did not claim the consequences were impossible. She did not pretend change was harmless. "You are right," she said. Several council members exchanged uncertain looks. "Then why?" Valar asked. Lyra looked at the data floating between them. "Because stability cannot be measured only by how long a system continues operating." The chamber became still. "Sometimes," she continued, "a system survives because the people inside it carry the weight of its failures." The council expected a defense of Alexander Reed. They expected her to argue that the human was correct and the empire was wrong. But that was not what happened. "Alexander Reed is not the reason this happened," Lyra said. "He is the person who showed us what we refused to examine." The first time Lyra met Alexander, she did not see a hero. She saw a human businessman investigating imperial logistics. Someone who believed data could reveal problems hidden beneath official reports. But the more she learned about him, the more complicated the truth became. Alexander was not an outsider who arrived with perfect answers. He was someone who had already made similar mistakes on Earth. He had built efficient systems that overlooked people who did not fit the model. He knew the danger because he had been part of it. That was why his discovery mattered. He was not accusing the Empire from a position of superiority. He was warning it from experience. Valar looked toward Lyra. "You believe one human's perspective should influence an entire civilization?" Lyra remained silent for a moment. Then she answered carefully. "No." The response surprised the council. "One perspective should never control a civilization." She looked at the gathered leaders. "That is exactly why our system needs to change." The statement carried more weight than any accusation. The problem was not that the Empire listened to one human. The problem was that for too long, it had relied on systems that left too many voices unheard. Alexander Reed had not discovered corruption. He had discovered something more difficult. A civilization that had become too confident in its own methods to notice when reality had changed. Valar studied her expression. "And what happens if your solution fails?" Lyra looked toward the massive windows overlooking the capital. "Billions of lives moved beneath those lights." "Then we admit it failed," she said. "And we improve it. For generations, Aurelian leaders had believed strength came from never appearing uncertain. Lyra was choosing something different. The courage to admit uncertainty before it became collapse. The council called her decision a betrayal. History would remember it as something else. Because the greatest threat to an empire was never the person who questioned it. It was the moment the empire became too afraid to question itself. Alexander Reed never feared difficult problems. He feared simple solutions. Years before his name became connected to the fate of the Aurelian Empire, he believed he had already learned the hardest lesson of leadership. He was wrong. The lesson he needed was not how to solve problems. It was how to recognize when a solution could become part of the problem itself. On Earth, Alexander had built one of the most advanced interplanetary logistics networks in human history. His company moved medical supplies, industrial equipment, and critical resources between Earth colonies with unmatched efficiency. Investors praised the system. Governments studied it. Other corporations copied it. The numbers were impressive. Delivery times improved. Costs decreased. Resource waste dropped by almost 40%. From a distance, everything looked perfect. But perfection was only visible from a distance. Alexander remembered the night he realized something was wrong. He was standing inside a small operations center on a lunar settlement, reviewing a delayed shipment report. The algorithm had made the correct decision. The route was inefficient. The settlement population was low. The economic value was limited. The system had calculated that delaying the shipment created the least overall impact. The calculation was accurate. The conclusion was wrong. A maintenance technician named Elena had spent 3 weeks repairing damaged equipment because the replacement parts were considered a lower priority. The colony survived. The numbers remained positive. The system reported success. But Alexander could not forget the look on Elena's face when she said, "The system knew we were struggling. It just decided we could struggle longer." That sentence stayed with him longer than any criticism from investors. Because she was right. The failure was not in the data. The failure was believing the data represented the entire reality. After that moment, Alexander changed how he worked. He still trusted information. He still valued efficiency. But he began asking different questions. Who was missing from the model? What cost was invisible because nobody measured it? How many people carried the burden of a decision made thousands of miles away? Those questions eventually brought him to the Aurelian Empire. His company had partnered with several imperial trade networks, giving him access to transportation records across distant colonies. At first, he was impressed. The empire's systems were ancient but remarkably stable. Resource distribution covered thousands of worlds. Autonomous management networks coordinated complex supply chains. The civilization had survived for centuries because it valued continuity. Then Alexander noticed something familiar. The reports were too clean. Colonies marked as stable showed repeated emergency requests. Infrastructure listed as operational had maintenance delays stretching across years. Resource projections appeared accurate, but the assumptions behind them were outdated. He did not accuse the empire of corruption. That would have been easy. He saw something more complicated. A system created by intelligent people, maintained by responsible leaders, slowly becoming unable to recognize changes around it. Alexander submitted his findings through official channels. He expected debate. He expected questions. Instead, he received careful responses. Reviews would be scheduled. Committees would examine the issue. Additional analysis would be conducted. The language was professional, respectful, familiar. He had used those same words years ago when defending his own decisions. That realization bothered him more than rejection, because he knew what happened when a system believed it had more time than it actually did. His investigation eventually reached Princess Lyra Valen. She did not contact him because she trusted him. She contacted him because she needed to know whether he was wrong. Their first meeting took place inside an old archive station near the imperial border. No royal ceremony. No corporate presentation. Only 2 people surrounded by decades of forgotten records. Lyra studied him carefully. "You believe the empire has failed?" she asked. Alexander looked at the data between them. "No," he paused. "I think the empire succeeded for so long that it stopped noticing when success started changing." For the first time, the princess saw something unexpected. The human standing before her was not someone trying to replace her civilization. He was someone who had already learned the danger of making that mistake. Princess Lyra Valen was not assigned to investigate Alexander Reed because the Empire trusted him. She was assigned because the Empire did not. The official order arrived 12 hours after his findings reached the Imperial Security Council. It was written with respectful language, careful diplomacy, and the unmistakable authority of someone who expected obedience. Investigate the human consultant. Verify his claims. Determine whether his influence represented a threat to Imperial stability. Lyra accepted the order without hesitation. That was what everyone expected from her. Duty came before personal opinion. But what they did not know was that Lyra had already begun questioning the same system she was sent to defend. She met Alexander again inside the abandoned archive station near the Imperial border. The facility had once been a center of exploration. Now, its corridors were quiet, its systems maintained only because automated protocols kept them alive. Dust did not exist in the controlled environment, but neglect had its own appearance. Old displays, unused research terminals, equipment that still functioned but had not evolved in decades. Alexander noticed her looking around. "You see it too," he said. Lyra turned toward him. "See what?" "A system that works because everyone is afraid to replace it." She did not respond immediately. That answer bothered her because part of her believed he was wrong. The Empire had survived for centuries. Stability was not an accident. It was the result of discipline, experience, and careful leadership. "You judge the Empire quickly for someone who has only studied its records," she said. Alexander nodded. "Fair." The agreement surprised her. "You are not going to argue?" "Should I?" he asked. "You know this civilization better than I do." He moved toward the central archive table and activated the old systems. But knowing something for centuries does not guarantee understanding what it has become. Together, they examined the original allocation models. The deeper they went, the more complicated the picture became. The Empire had not ignored its colonies. It had created one of the most advanced resource networks in known space. Autonomous systems predicted demand. Logistics routes were constantly optimized. Emergency responses were prioritized by probability calculations. The design was brilliant. The problem was the assumptions. The models had been created generations earlier when colonies were smaller, communication was slower, and expansion followed different patterns. The system was not broken. It was answering the wrong questions. Lyra studied the projections silently. "The Imperial Allocation AI has never failed an official performance review," she said. Alexander looked at the data. "I believe that." She looked at him. "Then why are you still concerned?" He pointed toward the colony reports. "Because success is being measured by output, not by effort." He highlighted a remote settlement. "This colony maintains acceptable production levels because local engineers are constantly repairing aging systems. The model sees stability. It does not see exhaustion." The words remained between them. Lyra had spent years reviewing reports exactly like these. She had trusted the system because the system had always given answers. Now she wondered how many questions had never been asked. "You want to expose this publicly," she said. It was not a question. Alexander looked at her. "I want people to know what is happening." "That is not the same thing." The difference caught his attention. Lyra stepped closer to the display. "You see the truth as information. I see the truth as a responsibility." Alexander studied her carefully. "Explain." "If we reveal that thousands of systems require reform, people will not only hear the problem, they will react to the fear surrounding it." She pointed toward the network map. "Markets, supply chains, political factions. A civilization of this size does not move like a single machine." For the first time, Alexander had no immediate answer. Because she was right. He had spent years learning that data needed human context. Yet he was still tempted to believe enough information could force the correct outcome. Lyra noticed the hesitation. "You thought you were different from the people who ignored your warnings." Alexander looked away. The statement reached deeper than she intended. "Maybe I was," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm still learning." That was the moment something changed between them. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition. The princess did not see a human trying to control her empire. She saw someone who understood the danger of becoming certain. And Alexander did not see a ruler protecting an outdated system. He saw someone carrying the responsibility of billions of lives. Then the archive doors opened. Imperial security officers entered with a formal authorization request. Lyra read the message on the display. She already knew what it meant. The Empire had noticed their investigation. Alexander watched her expression. "What happens now?" he asked. Lyra closed the file. "Now," she said, "we find out whether the Empire wants the truth more than it wants to remain comfortable." The first lesson Lyra Valen learned after leaving the capital was that an empire could hide its problems without hiding the truth. The information existed. The reports existed. The warnings existed. They were simply separated into thousands of places where nobody had enough reason to connect them. That changed when she and Alexander Reed traveled beyond the central worlds and saw the consequences directly. Their first destination was Nera 12, a remote industrial colony located near the edge of Aurelian territory. According to the Imperial Allocation AI, Nera 12 was classified as stable. Production remained above projected levels. Resource consumption was within acceptable limits. Emergency risk was considered minimal. The report was technically correct. The reality was not. When their transport landed, Lyra saw a colony that survived through constant adaptation. Workers maintained aging equipment with replacement parts from outdated systems. Engineers created temporary solutions because official upgrades were scheduled years into the future. Nothing was broken enough to trigger an emergency. Everything was struggling enough to require attention. Alexander walked through the maintenance district without saying much. Lyra noticed that immediately. The human who had challenged the Empire with data was now standing among the people behind those numbers, watching instead of explaining. An engineer named Taryn Voss guided them through an atmospheric regulation facility. The machine occupied most of the room, surrounded by layers of unofficial modifications. This system was designed for a 20-year operational cycle, Alexander said while checking the records. Taryn nodded. It reached 38. Lyra looked at him. Why was it not replaced? The engineer activated a maintenance request history. Hundreds of entries appeared. Approved. Reviewed. Prioritized. Delayed. The replacement was never rejected, Taryn explained. The system simply determined that other locations required resources more urgently. Alexander studied the information. And your colony continued operating. Taryn gave a small smile. That is what the reports say. The answer carried more weight than any accusation. Later that evening, Lyra reviewed the colony data inside their temporary residence. She expected Alexander to be angry. Instead, he looked uncomfortable. "You are not surprised," she said. Alexander remained focused on the reports. "I am." "Then why do you look like you expected this?" He was silent for a moment. "Because I have seen this mistake before." He explained that the colony was not being ignored by careless people. It was being managed by a system designed to prioritize measurable outcomes. The AI did exactly what it was built to do. It protected the Empire's overall efficiency. The problem was that efficiency had no way to measure exhaustion. It could count production. It could calculate failure probability. It could not calculate how many people were sacrificing their time, health, and resources to keep those numbers alive. Lyra looked at the colony map displayed above the table. Hundreds of worlds appeared as points of light. So the system is not corrupt. Alexander shook his head. No, then what is it? He looked at the aging equipment report. Successful for too long. The answer stayed with her. Because it changed the problem completely. If the Empire was corrupt, the solution was simple. Remove the corruption. But if the Empire was outdated, the solution required something much harder. Convincing good people that something they built with good intentions was no longer enough. When they returned to the transport, Lyra received a message from Chancellor Valer Thane. The council requested a full explanation of her actions. Not a trial. Not an accusation. A request. That detail mattered. Valer was not trying to silence her. He was trying to understand the risk. During the journey back, Lyra read the message several times. Alexander noticed. You respect him. She looked up. I disagree with him. That is not what I asked. A quiet moment passed. Yes, she admitted. Because he remembers what happens when civilizations change too quickly. Alexander nodded. And you remember what happens when they refuse to change. Neither of them spoke after that. They had reached the point where the problem was no longer about who was right. The Empire was facing two dangers at once. Changing too quickly could create instability. Refusing to change could create something worse. The answer would not come from one person. Not from a princess. Not from a human. Not from an algorithm. It would require something the Empire had avoided for generations. The willingness to admit that even the most advanced system in the galaxy could still need to learn. The meeting inside the Imperial Council chamber lasted for 6 hours, but the most important moments happened in the silence between words. For generations, the Aurelian Empire had survived because its leaders understood one principle above all others. Stability was not created by avoiding problems. Stability was created by controlling them before they became disasters. That belief was why Chancellor Valar Thane opposed Alexander Reed. Not because he hated the human, not because he denied the evidence, because he had seen what happened when civilizations changed faster than their people could adapt. Valar stood beside the central display as thousands of colony reports moved through the chamber. "The data is credible," he said. The admission surprised several council members. The question is not whether Alexander Reed discovered a problem. The question is whether revealing that problem immediately creates a larger one. Lyra remained silent. She understood his position because it was the same fear she had carried only weeks earlier. Alexander looked at the projection of the Empire's resource network. Thousands of worlds connected by invisible lines. Supply routes, communication systems, economic dependencies. A civilization too large for one simple answer. "You want to delay public disclosure," Alexander said. Valar looked at him calmly. "I want to prevent panic from becoming another crisis." Alexander stepped closer to the display. "And how long does the Empire continue waiting?" The question was not aggressive. It was honest. Valar did not respond immediately. He had spent centuries making decisions where every option carried a cost. Long enough to prepare. Lyra watched both of them. The human and the Chancellor represented two different fears. Alexander feared that silence would allow problems to grow. Valar feared that sudden change would damage the people they were trying to protect. Neither fear was irrational. That was what made the decision difficult. Later that evening, Lyra and Alexander reviewed the full Imperial Allocation AI architecture. They discovered something neither expected. The system was not simply outdated. It had been adapting constantly. New data, new routes, new variables. Every adjustment had been logical. Every improvement had been approved. The problem was deeper. The original design philosophy had never changed. The AI had been created to maximize survival probability for the Empire as a whole. It was never designed to measure the human cost of maintaining that survival. Alexander stared at the model for a long time. "It is exactly like my old system." Lyra looked at him. "Your company?" He nodded. "I kept improving the calculations. I never questioned the question itself." The realization affected him more than he admitted. The Empire was not repeating a mistake because it lacked intelligence. It was repeating a mistake because intelligent people trusted a successful method for too long. Lyra turned toward the window overlooking the capital. "If we release everything now, some worlds will demand immediate answers." Alexander nodded. "And some will panic. If we hide it longer," she continued, "we prove that the system values stability more than honesty." They both understood the impossible choice. Truth without preparation could harm people. Stability without honesty could betray them. That night, they created a third option. Not silence. Not uncontrolled exposure. A transition. Independent colony representatives would verify the findings. Local leaders would receive support before announcements reached the public. The Imperial Allocation AI would remain active, but its decisions would no longer be treated as unquestionable conclusions. It would become a tool instead of an authority. When they presented the proposal, Valar studied it carefully. "You are asking the Empire to admit that its greatest achievement has limitations." Lyra answered before Alexander could. "No. We are asking the Empire to prove that its greatest achievement can improve." The Chancellor looked at her for a long moment. The princess who once represented tradition was now defending adaptation. The human who once believed in perfect solutions was now defending a slower, more complicated path. Neither had won the argument. They had created something neither could have created alone. The council approved the proposal for review. It was not a victory. It was permission to begin. But as the decision spread through the Empire, a new problem emerged. The truth was no longer hidden. And now everyone would have to decide what they valued more. The comfort of believing the old system was enough, or the courage to build something better. Alexander Reed had always believed that admitting a mistake was a sign of strength. But standing inside the quiet observation chamber of the research vessel, Watching thousands of imperial systems update in real time, he realized there was another level of honesty he had avoided for years. Admitting that a mistake existed was easy. Admitting that the way you search for solutions was also flawed was much harder. The reform proposal displayed before him was the most balanced solution he had ever created. It combined Lyra's understanding of political consequences with his own analysis of systemic failures. It protected stability while allowing change. On paper, it was exactly what the Empire needed. Yet something still bothered him. Lyra noticed before he said anything. "You disagree with our own plan," she said. Alexander looked at the holographic model. "I'm questioning whether it goes far enough." She stepped closer. "Why?" He expanded the original Imperial Allocation AI framework. "Because this is the same mistake I made on Earth." Lyra studied his expression. Alexander rarely spoke about his past. When he did, it was usually through numbers and reports, not memories. "My company had the same problem," he said. "Not the same scale, not the same technology, but the same idea." He touched the model, showing resource distribution patterns. "We optimized for what we could measure. Delivery times, costs, efficiency." The display changed to old human records. "And we assumed anything outside the model was an exception." Lyra remained silent. "It wasn't," Alexander continued. "It was the part we failed to understand." He remembered Elena from the lunar settlement, the exhausted maintenance teams, the communities that survived because ordinary people compensated for invisible flaws. The system had never intended to hurt them. That was what made the lesson difficult. Harm did not always come from bad intentions. Sometimes it came from good intentions combined with incomplete understanding. "You blame yourself," Lyra said. Alexander looked at her. "I blame the assumption." "Which assumption?" He looked back at the stars. "That being correct is the same as being right." The sentence remained between them. Lyra understood because she carried a similar burden. For most of her life, she had believed loyalty meant protecting the Empire's continuity. She had defended traditions because she knew the chaos that could follow careless change. But now she understood another danger. A civilization could preserve itself so carefully that it stopped becoming better. Their conversation was interrupted by a message from Chancellor Valar Thane. The council had requested Alexander's presence, not as an accused individual, as a witness. That distinction mattered. When Alexander entered the chamber, Valar studied him for several moments before speaking. "You understand that many believe this crisis exists because of your involvement." Alexander nodded. "Yes. And do you believe they are wrong?" Alexander considered the question. No, the response surprised everyone. An outsider influencing an entire civilization would be dangerous. He looked toward the council members. "That is why I should not be the person deciding what happens next." Silence filled the chamber. Valar leaned back slightly. "You discovered the problem and now refuse authority over the solution." Alexander nodded. "Because discovering a problem does not make someone qualified to control the future." Lyra watched the council's reaction carefully. This was the moment that separated Alexander from the image many had created of him. He was not a human trying to replace alien leadership. He was someone who understood the danger of believing one perspective was enough. The council eventually approved the next phase of reforms. But the decision did not create immediate trust. Some colonies remained suspicious. Some officials resisted. Some citizens questioned why an ancient empire needed advice from a human. That was expected. Trust was not created by a single announcement. It was built through consistent choices. Later that night, Lyra stood beside Alexander on the observation deck. The capital's lights stretched across the planet below. "You know," she said, "most people would have accepted the power this situation offered." Alexander looked at the city. "That's exactly why someone shouldn't have it." For the first time since their journey began, Lyra smiled. Not because the problem was solved. It was not. But because the people trying to solve it had finally understood something important. The future of the Empire would not depend on finding one perfect leader. It would depend on creating a system where no leader had to pretend to be one. The day Princess Lyra Valen lost her royal title was not marked by anger. It was marked by silence. Across the Aurelian Empire, citizens watched the official announcement without knowing whether they were witnessing the beginning of a collapse or the beginning of something new. The princess who had represented tradition for decades was now standing against the very structure that had created her. But Lyra understood something many people did not. A crown was never the true measure of leadership. The choices made when the crown was threatened were. The Imperial Council gathered again inside the Hall of Sovereignty. This time, the atmosphere was different. The evidence was no longer a hidden concern. The colony reports had been verified by independent analysts. The Imperial Allocation AI had been reviewed. The outdated assumptions behind resource distribution were confirmed. The Empire could no longer pretend the problem did not exist. But acknowledging a problem did not mean everyone agreed on the solution. Chancellor Valar Thane stood before the council with a serious expression. The proposed reforms will change how authority is distributed across thousands of worlds, he said. That is not a technical adjustment. It is a transformation of governance. Lyra looked toward him. She respected him because he understood the weight of that sentence. He was not defending the old system because he loved tradition. He was defending it because he had seen civilizations break when change moved faster than people could survive. You believe we are moving too quickly, Lyra said. Valar nodded. I believe good intentions do not remove consequences. The words were difficult because they were true. Lyra had once thought admitting the Empire's flaws was the hardest step. Now she understood the harder one. Changing a civilization meant accepting that even the correct choice could create new problems. The council requested Alexander's recommendation. The human billionaire who had started the investigation walked to the center of the chamber. Everyone expected him to demand control over the solution. Instead, he surprised them. I do not recommend placing this responsibility on me. Several council members reacted immediately. Valar watched carefully. Why? Alexander looked at the resource models displayed around the room. Because I found the problem. That does not mean I understand every consequence of fixing it. The chamber became quiet. The Empire is not a machine. It is millions of lives connected together. A person who understands one part of the system should not control the whole system. For the first time, some council members saw Alexander differently. He was not another powerful figure asking for influence. He was someone refusing it. The final vote was not a victory for Lyra. It was not a defeat for the council. The Empire approved a transitional framework. Colony representatives would participate in resource decisions. Independent reviews would challenge AI recommendations. Local conditions would become part of imperial planning. The old system would not disappear overnight. It would evolve. But the cost came immediately. Political factions accused Lyra of weakening imperial authority. Some citizens believed she had allowed an outsider to influence their civilization. Others believed she had finally given them a voice. The palace corridors that once carried certainty now carried debate. That was the price of change. For generations, the Empire had valued unity because disagreement seemed dangerous. Now it had to learn that disagreement could also be a form of strength. Later that evening, Lyra removed the final symbol of royal authority from her ceremonial uniform. Not as a rejection of her heritage, as an acceptance of responsibility. Alexander watched quietly. You know they may never forgive you, he said. Lyra looked at the empty space where the symbol had been. Maybe. She paused. But forgiveness was never the reason. She looked toward the stars beyond the capital. The Empire cannot survive because everyone believes it is perfect. Alexander stood beside her. Then why should it survive? Lyra answered without hesitation. Because it is willing to become better. That was the moment the galaxy misunderstood her the most. They believed a princess had sacrificed a throne for a human. The truth was different. She sacrificed the idea that power meant never changing. And in doing so, she gave her civilization something far more valuable than a crown. The ability to change without losing itself. The first real test of the new system did not come from the Imperial Council. It came from the people who had the most to lose if the reform failed. 6 months after the transition framework was approved, the outer colony of Vera Station sent an emergency request to the capital. The message was short. Their primary resource reactor network was operating below safe capacity. Production had slowed. Supply reserves were decreasing. The situation was not yet a disaster. But the warning signs were clear. The Imperial Allocation AI predicted that the colony could maintain operations for 11 more weeks. Several council members considered that acceptable. 11 weeks allowed time for careful planning, time for political discussions, time for avoiding unnecessary public concern. Lyra Valen disagreed. She had learned that waiting for certainty often meant waiting until certainty was impossible to achieve. Inside the council chamber, Opinions divided quickly. If we announce the situation now, every connected colony will question their own stability, one representative said. Fear will spread faster than information. Lyra listened without interrupting. Years earlier, she might have accepted the argument immediately. Protecting public confidence had always been part of her training. But she remembered Nera, 12. She remembered the engineers maintaining impossible systems because official reports said everything was stable. And if we say nothing? She asked. The representative hesitated. We continue monitoring. Lyra looked toward the reactor data floating above the chamber. That is not monitoring. That is hoping. The room became silent. The decision reached Alexander Reed later that evening. He found Lyra in the analysis room, reviewing thousands of possible outcomes. You are considering revealing everything, he said. She did not look away from the display. I am considering what happens if we do not. Alexander studied the projections. There is still risk. Lyra nodded. I know. Some people will panic. Yes. Some leaders will blame you. She finally looked at him. Yes. Alexander waited for the hesitation that usually came before difficult decisions. It never arrived. Lyra had changed. Not because she no longer feared consequences. Because she had learned that fear could not be the only reason a civilization made choices. The announcement was prepared differently from the old imperial broadcasts. No dramatic declarations. No promises that everything would be solved. The message included the known facts, the uncertainties, and the actions already being taken. Colony leaders received direct communication before the public announcement. Technical teams were deployed. Independent experts reviewed the situation alongside imperial systems. The Empire did not hide the problem. It also did not abandon people to it. The reaction was immediate. Some citizens criticized the decision. Some claimed Lyra had created unnecessary concern. But something unexpected happened. Other colonies began sending their own reports. Not because they were afraid, because they finally believed their information would matter. Within days, hundreds of worlds submitted maintenance concerns that had previously remained unnoticed. The crisis at Vera Station revealed something more important than a reactor failure. It revealed how many voices had been missing from the system. Chancellor Valer Thane watched the reports arrive in silence. He had expected instability. He had prepared for political damage. What he had not expected was participation. He found Lyra outside the council chamber after the emergency meeting. I was wrong about one thing, he said. Lyra looked surprised. Valer rarely admitted mistakes. About what? I believe stability came from preventing uncertainty. He looked at the growing list of colony responses. Perhaps stability comes from knowing what to do when uncertainty arrives. Lyra did not answer immediately. The words mattered because they came from someone who had opposed her. Alexander joined them moments later. He looked at the updated reports. The system is still imperfect. Lyra nodded. It always will be. Then why does this feel different? Alexander asked. She watched the colony signals appearing across the display. Because now the system can hear when it is wrong. For centuries, the Aurelian Empire had measured strength by endurance, by surviving every challenge without appearing weak. Now it was learning a different kind of strength, the ability to admit a problem before someone else had to suffer from it. The galaxy had expected Lyra Valen's greatest sacrifice to be giving up her crown. But the harder sacrifice was accepting that no leader, no algorithm, and no empire could protect the future alone. A civilization survived not because it never failed. It survived because it learned faster than its failures could define it. Years later, historians would debate the exact moment the Aurelian Empire truly changed. Some believed it was the day Princess Lyra Valen challenged the Imperial Council. Others believed it was the moment Alexander Reed revealed the weaknesses hidden inside the Empire's oldest systems. But those who lived through that era remembered something different. The Empire did not change because one person discovered the truth. It changed because millions of people decided the truth was worth facing. The Hall of Sovereignty remained almost unchanged after decades. The same ancient walls surrounded the same chamber where generations of leaders had made decisions affecting countless worlds. But one detail was different. The throne was no longer placed above the council floor. It stood at the same level as every other seat. A small adjustment, almost invisible, yet it represented everything Lyra had learned. Authority was not meant to separate leaders from the people they served. It was meant to connect them. Princess Lyra Valen entered the chamber without the symbols that once defined her position. Not because she rejected her heritage, because she understood that tradition was valuable only when it continued serving its purpose. Chancellor Valar Thane was already there, reviewing the latest reports from the Reformed Resource Network. The old Chancellor looked older than before. Not weaker, just more aware of the weight carried by every decision. The system is still imperfect, Valar said. Lyra looked at the reports. It always will be. He studied her answer. Years earlier, he would have considered that unacceptable. An empire was supposed to create certainty. Now he understood something different. A civilization that demanded perfection from its systems would eventually hide every imperfection from itself. Alexander Reed refused another advisory position today, Valar said. A small smile appeared on Lyra's face. That sounds like him. The human who had once been accused of trying to influence an empire had spent years refusing every opportunity to control it. He continued working with the reform teams, analyzing data, questioning assumptions, and challenging decisions when necessary. But he never became the leader some people expected him to become, because he understood something important. The purpose of reform was not replacing one powerful person with another. It was creating a structure where no single person was powerful enough to decide everything. Outside the capital, the empire continued changing slowly. Some reforms succeeded immediately. Others required adjustment. Some colonies still disagreed with central decisions. Some officials still preferred the old methods. But disagreement was no longer treated as failure. It became part of the process. Years after the first investigation began, Alexander returned with Lyra to the old archive station where they had discovered the forgotten colony reports. The facility looked almost identical. The same quiet corridors. The same old research terminals. But the difference was impossible to miss. The archive was no longer abandoned. Scientists, colony representatives, and administrators worked together inside the once empty halls. You know, Alexander said while watching the activity around them, I spent most of my life trying to build systems that never failed. Lyra looked at him. And now? He looked through the station window toward the stars. Now I think the best systems are the ones that know how to recover. She remained silent for a moment. Then she asked, do you think the Empire will remember what happened? Alexander smiled slightly. Not the way we remember it. He was right. History would simplify their choices. Some would say an alien princess betrayed her empire for a human billionaire. Some would say a human changed the future of an entire species. But the truth was quieter. A princess and a human discovered that progress did not come from being the strongest civilization in the galaxy. It came from being willing to question whether strength was being used correctly. The Aurelian Empire did not become perfect. It became honest. And that honesty became its greatest survival mechanism. Because every advanced civilization eventually faces the same choice. Protect the image of what it has always been, or accept the responsibility of becoming something better. Among the stars, humanity was remembered not because it brought the galaxy perfect answers. It was remembered because it taught the galaxy something far more difficult. The courage to admit when an answer was incomplete, and the compassion to keep searching anyway. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. We hope this journey across the stars brought you inspiration and emotion. Share your thoughts and feelings about the story in the comments below. Subscribe to Galactic Contact for more unforgettable sci-fi adventures and extraordinary tales from the universe.